Lawrence Adamaco was 43 years old, a man who had spent 20 years building businesses other people ran, while his own name stayed off the door. He drove a sedan that was 8 years old and ran clean because he kept up the maintenance himself. He wore the same charcoal coat to every meeting for 4 years because it still did the job, and he saw no reason to announce himself with clothes. That spring, his wife told him she was filing for divorce, and she said it with the satisfaction of a woman who'd already lined up her advantage. She'd retained one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the city. A man, she said, would leave you with the truck and your pride, if that. She named the firm proudly at the dinner table. Lawrence set down his fork. He knew the firm. He'd owned it, quietly, through a holding company, for 6 years. She had no idea she'd just hired a lawyer from a building he held the title to. She had no idea how wrong she was about the man she decided to take to the cleaners. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The office was still dark when Lawrence came in. No sunrise yet, just the hum of the building waking up and the cold of a floor the heat hadn't reached. He filled his thermos in the small kitchen and carried it to the corner office that didn't have his name on the door, because none of his offices did. He sat down to the work the way he did every morning, before the staff arrived, when the numbers were just numbers and they either reconciled or they didn't, and no one was there to spin them. He read the overnight reports the way he read everything, looking for the one line that didn't belong, because the one that didn't belong was the one that mattered. He did not yet know that the same habit was about to protect him from a woman who'd spent a year planning to take him apart. He only knew the work, and the work was honest, and that had always been enough. Lawrence had spent 18 years building a quiet portfolio of professional businesses, a couple of medical practices, an accounting group, and 6 years ago, a controlling stake in a respected law firm whose retiring founder had wanted it left in steady hands rather than sold to a chain. Lawrence held it through a holding company that bore none of their names. He took no part in the firm's cases. He set its standards, funded its growth, and stayed entirely out of its files. Because the whole value of a law firm was its independence, and he understood that the fastest way to destroy what he'd bought was to touch it. He had built all of this with his own capital, and after his uncle passed, with an inheritance the family never discussed, kept in his name in accounts his wife never asked to see. Renata had decided early what Lawrence was, a man who consulted for small companies, vaguely, unimpressively. A man whose charcoal coat embarrassed her at functions. He had let her believe it, because correcting her felt like boasting, and he had never once needed an audience for what he'd built. He didn't know it then, but she'd been planning her exit for over a year, assembling her advantages, certain she understood the size of the man she was leaving. She had the size exactly backward. The night she told him, she dressed for it, and she delivered the news the way a person delivers a winning hand. She said she'd retained Marcus Vane, a name that meant something in the city's uglier divorces, a lawyer known for scorched earth tactics, and that Vane's firm would make sure Lawrence walked away with as little as the law allowed. She named the firm. She said it twice, watching his face for the fear she'd come for. Lawrence set his fork down on his plate. He didn't drop it. He set it down with the same care he gave a contract he intended to read twice, like a man placing a tool he meant to pick up again. "All right," he said. The mildness of it confused her, because she'd braced for panic, and a man without panic was a man she hadn't planned for. He noticed, the way he noticed a figure that didn't reconcile, 2 things he did not react to. The first was that she'd chosen Marcus Vane specifically, and that Vane, he happened to know, had been brought into the firm recently by a partner Lawrence had been quietly watching for cutting corners. The second was that her phone lit on the table with a message from a contact saved only as M, and she turned it face down too fast. He filed both away. He didn't decide yet what they meant. But that night, in his study, he opened a notebook and wrote the date and what she'd said, in his own hand, the way he logged anything worth remembering. The first thing he did the next morning was not clever. It was correct. He called Walter, the attorney who handled his holding company and his own affairs, entirely separate from the firm he owned. And he told Walter the situation in full, because the situation was a conflict of interest, and conflicts of interest do not get quietly exploited. They get disclosed. My wife has retained a lawyer at a firm I own a controlling interest in, Lawrence said. I have never touched their files, and I'm not going to start now. I want this handled by the book, screened properly, the way it would be for anyone. That's the only way it can be handled, Walter said. And it's the way that's going to cost her the advantage she thinks she has. Not because you'll do anything, but because the firm will have to do everything right. What Lawrence had built, over 9 years of marriage, was not the upper hand at that dinner. He understood that now. What he'd built was a habit of giving Renata the unremarkable version of himself that let her keep her image among people who measured a man by his coat. He thought, in his study that night, about the years of small corrections he'd let pass. The dinner where she'd asked him, in front of her sister, to let the adults talk about money when the subject of an investment came up. Money he understood better than anyone at the table. The way she introduced him at her functions as, my husband, he consults. It's very boring, don't ask. And steered the conversation away before anyone could. The birthday she'd given him a nicer coat with a note that said, for when you want to look like you're doing well. Not knowing the holding company he ran from a nameless office had quietly become one of the larger privately held things in the city. He had absorbed each one without comment, the way a well-capitalized business absorbs a bad quarter without visible strain, because making a point of it would have embarrassed her among her people. And he had decided long ago to carry that cost himself. He saw now what the carrying had taught her, that there was no floor to how small she could make him in public, because he would never make her pay for it. She had built her entire sense of their marriage on that lesson. She was about to learn it had never been the whole ledger. 3 years earlier, when her gallery venture had stalled, he had quietly covered $60,000 of it, routed so it looked as if the business had simply held, and she'd told her sister she'd managed it herself. He had let her have that too. He had a long history of letting her have things, including the belief that she was the more formidable of the two of them. His Aunt Adeline had watched all of it. She was 71, small with silver hair pinned close and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She had never said a word against Renata, because Adeline was the kind of woman who waited to be asked. She lived in the tidy house near the old courthouse that Lawrence had bought back for the family the year his uncle passed, and her kitchen smelled of coffee and cedar and something sweet always cooling on the counter. She was the one person in his world who knew what he actually owned and never once mentioned it to anyone. She said his name like it had weight. That was what Renata had never understood. Until the spring everything turned. Adeline had been the only one counting on his side. He went to her that evening. He sat at her table and ate because she made him, and the quiet of her kitchen did what the cold of his own house had stopped doing years ago. She watched him over the glasses. She hired a lawyer from your own firm, Adeline said, and almost smiled. Does she know? She has no idea, Lawrence said. And I'm not going to use it the way she'd use it if our places were swapped. Walter's reporting the conflict. The firm will screen it. Adeline folded her hands. Good, she said. Then eat. Because there's something you should know about why she picked that man in particular. She told him then what she'd been watching from the edges all year. Renata had been seeing someone since the previous autumn, a man named Marcus, the same first name she'd half revealed on her phone, though not the lawyer, a different Marcus. A developer named Marcus Dell, who'd been struggling to keep his projects funded. Adeline had a memory for faces and a notebook for things that didn't fit. Black cover, spiral bound. She set it on the table and opened it. The first entry was dated in October. Dates, the man, the restaurant, the car. And one line in her precise hand that mattered more than the rest. The lawyer Renata had hired, Marcus Vane, and the boyfriend, Marcus Dell, were not strangers. Vane had done legal work for Dell's failing development company. The lawyer and the lover were already connected. There's more, Adeline said, but it can wait until you've talked to Walter again. What Walter and the forensic accountant Falami assembled over the following weeks was not a scheme. It was an accounting of what was already true, surfaced properly once the conflict forced everything into the open. When Walter formally disclosed Lawrence's ownership interest to the firm's managing partners, the firm did exactly what a firm with the standards Lawrence had funded was obliged to do. It screened the matter, walled the case off from anyone connected to ownership, and, in reviewing the file as conflicts review requires, its ethics partner found that Marcus Vane had taken Renata's case without disclosing his own prior relationship with her boyfriend's company. That was Vane's conflict, not Lawrence's, and it was disqualifying. Worse for Renata, the review surfaced the reason the connection mattered. Money had been moving. Falami traced it. Over the spring, Renata had moved $52,000 out of the household account into Marcus Dell's Development, LLC, framed in her own notes as household and legal expenses, financing the boyfriend's projects with Lawrence's earnings, while planning to claim poverty in the divorce. Vane had structured some of it. The lawyer she'd hired to strip Lawrence bare had helped move Lawrence's own money to her lover. Lawrence spread it all on Adeline's table the way he laid out a balance sheet before a decision, not reading any single line, reading all of it together, feeling where the numbers connected. The lover's failing company. The lawyer who'd worked for that company. The wife who'd hired that lawyer to take apart the husband whose money she was already routing to the lover. And underneath all of it, the building itself, his for 6 years. The floor they'd all been standing on without knowing whose it was. It was not a tangle. It was a structure. And once he saw the load paths, he saw that every line ran back to the same beam, and that the beam was sound, and that it was his. He could see the whole shape of it now. He didn't move fast. That was the part she would never account for. Renata had spent 9 years deciding what kind of man Lawrence was, and she'd been wrong about the only thing that mattered. She had mistaken his patience for the absence of capability. It wasn't. Patience was the most practiced skill he had, and it was simply the one she'd never had a reason to watch him use. If he'd wanted fast, he could have picked up the phone to the firm he owned and had her lawyer dealt with in an afternoon. And that, precisely, was the thing he would not do. Because doing it would have made him what she already was. He did the slower, cleaner thing. He let the conflict process run by the rules. He let Walter file the financial findings into the divorce record through proper channels. He understood sequencing. You do not move on a position before it's fully documented. She thinks she's holding the advantage, Lawrence said. She thinks she hired a weapon. Adeline said nothing. She refilled his coffee. The temptation in those weeks was specific, and he refused it cleanly. He owned the firm. A single conversation with the managing partners, Even a tone in a single sentence could have tilted things, and no one would ever have proven it. Walter had watched him think it through, and had said only, "If you touch it, you become the story." Lawrence knew it already, so he did the opposite of touching it. He insulated himself entirely. Instructed Walter that he wanted no information from the firm about Renata's case beyond what the conflict process required by law, and let the firm's own people reach their own conclusions without a whisper from the man who signed for the building. It cost him nothing in the end, because the firm he'd built to have standards simply applied them. The advantage he gained was the advantage of having been right about what the firm was, not an advantage he reached out and took. He let the divorce proceed on Renata's early terms, and let her keep believing she was ahead. He let the proceedings move on their own timeline, agreeing to the early terms Renata's side proposed, because every one of them rested on a picture of his worth that was years out of date, and she read his agreeableness as weakness. Then the conflict disclosure and the financial findings came due in the same week. At the settlement conference Vane himself had aggressively scheduled, certain he was about to dominate it. Lawrence arrived 40 minutes early. In any negotiation, the party who arrived last was already behind. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a neutral firm Walter had chosen, precisely because it was not the firm Lawrence owned. Long table, pale walls, the city flat and gray through the glass. Walter arrived and set his folders in a row and squared the edges. Folami sat beside him. The room was still, the kind of still that comes before a thing, not after it. Renata came in with Marcus Vane, brisk and confident, and behind them, to Lawrence's quiet note, Marcus Dell, who had no business at a settlement conference and had come anyway because neither of them yet understood what the day was. Renata glanced at Lawrence once, a quick assessment, and looked past him as though he were a formality to be processed. Vane opened the way he was famous for opening, hard and fast, listing what they intended to take. Walter let him finish. Then he laid the matter on the table one document at a time, the way Lawrence laid out a deal. "Before we discuss any terms," Walter said, "two matters require acknowledgement. The first concerns counsel." He set down the disclosure. "It has been formally established that Mr. Vane accepted this representation while having an undisclosed prior professional relationship with Mr. Dell's development company, a party, as the financial record will show, directly connected to the marital assets at issue. Mr. Vane's firm has identified this as a disqualifying conflict. He cannot continue on this matter." Vane started to speak. Walter slid the firm's own ethics determination across the table, on the letterhead of the firm Renata had hired, and Vane read it and stopped, because it was signed by his own managing partners. Folami placed the second set of documents down. Walter walked them through, factual, not cold, simply precise. The $52,000 moved from the household account into Marcus Dell's LLC. The dates, the destination, the notes in Renata's own hand, calling it legal and household expense, and the transactions Vane had helped structure. "These funds will be treated as marital assets dissipated and concealed," Walter said. "They are now part of the record." The silence in the room lasted 11 seconds. Lawrence counted them. Renata read the ethics determination twice. The letterhead of the very firm she'd hired to destroy him, now disqualifying her own lawyer. He watched her read it twice. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite recognition. It was the specific look of a person realizing the structure she'd built was standing on the wrong foundation, and had been the whole time. She had walked into that firm certain she'd armed herself. The page in her hands said she'd hired her advantage out of a building her husband owned, that the lawyer she'd trusted had been moving her husband's money to her lover, and that all of it was now in a record she could not cry away. Her hand came up to her mouth. Marcus Dell was already looking at the door. Vane was gathering his things. Lawrence did not enjoy the fall. He had not come for it. He gathered nothing from the table. He had brought only the record, and it had served its purpose. He buttoned the charcoal coat. He shook Walter's hand and Falami's. He walked toward the door. He stopped beside Renata. He said it quietly, only for her, not as performance, because it was meant for her. "You hired your whole case out of a building I've owned for 6 years, Lawrence said. I could have used that. The fact that I didn't is the part you were never able to imagine about me." He walked out without looking back. It did not happen all at once. Vane's disqualification became a problem larger than one case once his own firm understood what he'd hidden, and he did not stay at the firm Lawrence owned much longer, removed by partners protecting the standards Lawrence had funded. Marcus Dell's development company, cut off from the money Renata had been quietly feeding it, slid the rest of the way under, and the $52,000 was accounted for in the final orders. Renata kept what she'd asked for early in the filing and learned it did not amount to the leverage she'd performed at the dinner table. The friend she'd told her confident version to grew quiet when the record came out. She was not ruined in any loud way. She was simply smaller, carrying the particular weight of a person who'd brought a weapon to a room and discovered it had been hers to begin with. Not dramatically, just constantly. Lawrence did not talk about any of it. He kept working. He still owned the firm, and he still never touched its files, and the standards that had caught the conflict were the same standards that made it worth owning. He answered every serious call the same day. He never told the family what he held. 14 months later, on a cool evening in early October, Lawrence sat at Adeline's kitchen table with a glass of water while the neighborhood settled into night. Adeline's voice came from the next room, asking if he wanted the last of the cobbler. His thermos sat on the sill, filled for the morning, the dent in its side catching the light. He thought about the office at 6, the overnight reports waiting, the one line that might not reconcile. He did not think about the dinner table, or the named firm, or the look on her face. He thought about the work. He finished his water. He went and turned out the light. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.